The judge smirked, leaning back in his chair as he looked down at the young black boy standing in front of him. To him, this was just another open and shut case, another kid who needed to be taught a lesson about authority. The courtroom was filled with murmurs, some chuckling at the judge's amusement. He was about to play a game, a twisted version of truth or lie, to expose what he assumed was just another delinquent. What he didn't know, what no one in that room expected, was that the boy standing before him, Malcolm Mac Johnson, was no ordinary kid. He wasn't scared, he wasn't confused, he was waiting, watching, calculating. Because while the judge saw him as just a child, Malcolm was a legal genius with an IQ that could outmatch most attorneys. And when the judge started his little game, he had no idea that he was about to lose. Before we dive into this mind-blowing story, tell us, have you ever seen someone get underestimated only to shock the world? Comment below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible stories that will leave you thinking. Now, let's begin. The judge's smirk widened as he leaned forward, adjusting his robe. His name was Judge Harold Whitaker, a man who had spent the last 3 decades ruling his courtroom like a king on a throne. He was in his 60s with deep-set wrinkles, piercing blue eyes, and an air of arrogance that filled the room. For years, he had silenced defendants with nothing more than a dismissive wave of his hand. He had seen hundreds of cases like this, young black kids who got caught up in trouble, standing before him, powerless. But Malcolm Mac Johnson was not powerless. Standing at the defendant's table was a 14-year-old boy with a quiet but undeniable confidence. He was slim but sharp, his dark brown eyes scanning the courtroom like a chess player studying the board. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, his posture straight, unshaken. He wasn't shifting nervously, he wasn't fidgeting. He was waiting. Malcolm wasn't just a kid. He was a prodigy. His IQ was off the charts, and while other kids played video games, he studied law for fun. His mother, Angela Johnson, was a paralegal, and from the moment he was old enough to read, Malcolm had been surrounded by legal textbooks, court transcripts, and case files. He had an uncanny ability to remember laws, argue points, and dismantle legal arguments with ease. But right now, no one in that courtroom knew that. The case against Malcolm was weak at best. He had been accused of stealing a smartphone from an electronics store. The only evidence was a blurry security camera image of someone in a hoodie. The suspect's face wasn't visible, but because Malcolm had been near the store at the time, he was picked up by Officer Greg Harper, a cop with a habit of making quick arrests without much proof. Now he was here, not because the evidence was solid, but because the system wasn't built to give kids like him the benefit of the doubt. And Judge Whitaker? He was going to enjoy this. The courtroom itself was a grand but cold space, with towering marble walls and dark wooden benches. The American flag stood in the corner, and above the judge's seat, carved in stone, were the words, "Justice for all." But everyone in that room knew the truth. Justice wasn't always for everyone. A small audience had gathered in the courtroom, mostly people waiting for their own cases. Some were curious, others were indifferent. A few snickered as the judge tapped his gavel and spoke. "Let's make this simple, kid," Judge Whitaker said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We'll play a little game. It's called Truth or Lie. I ask, you answer. If you tell the truth, maybe I'll go easy on you. Sound fair?" Some people in the courtroom chuckled, The prosecutor smirked while Officer Harper stood with his arms crossed, already convinced of Malcolm's guilt. But Malcolm, he didn't even blink. He just smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Sure, Your Honor," Malcolm said, his voice smooth and steady. "Let's play." Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his smirk widening as he tapped his gavel lightly. He had played this game before, using his position to toy with defendants, making them squirm under pressure. To him, this was just another moment to assert his dominance, another case where his word was final. But this time, he had no idea who he was up against. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on Malcolm. The young boy stood calm, confident, unshaken. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. There was no sign of nervousness, no hesitation. This wasn't fear. This was control. "All right, kid," the judge said, his voice filled with mock amusement. "Let's begin. Were you in the electronics store on the day of the theft?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly as if carefully considering the question. Then he nodded. "Truth, I was in the store." A murmur ran through the audience. The prosecutor grinned, thinking this was already over. The judge leaned back, looking, pleased with himself. "And did you leave the store with a phone you didn't pay for?" Whitaker asked, his eyes gleaming as if he had already caught Malcolm in a lie. Malcolm's expression remained neutral. Lie. The judge's smirk wavered slightly. He tapped his fingers against the bench. "Are you sure about that?" Malcolm nodded. "Very sure, Your Honor. But here's where it gets interesting. What matters in law is not just where someone was, but intent. Were they intending to commit a crime? Did they have possession of stolen property? Did they act with criminal purpose? The prosecutor's grin disappeared. The judge's fingers tightened around his gavel. The mood in the courtroom shifted subtly. What had started as a game was quickly becoming something else entirely. "You trying to play lawyer, kid?" Whitaker asked, his voice carrying a hint of annoyance now. Malcolm shrugged. "No, Your Honor. I'm just stating facts. Since this is a game of truth or lie, let's talk about the truth." He turned to the prosecutor. "You're basing your case on a security video, correct?" The prosecutor hesitated before nodding. "Yes." "Truth," Malcolm said, nodding slightly. "But the lie? That video doesn't actually prove I stole anything." The prosecutor stiffened. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "The video is blurry," Malcolm continued. "The person in the footage is wearing a hoodie, which makes it impossible to clearly identify them. And even more important, Your Honor." Malcolm turned toward the prosecutor, his sharp eyes gleaming. "There was another person in that store wearing the exact same hoodie that day." Gasps rippled through the room. People exchanged glances, whispers breaking out across the benches. The prosecutor fumbled with his notes. That's irrelevant. You were there, and your fingerprints were found in the store." Malcolm smiled slightly. "Truth, my fingerprints were found in the store. But isn't that normal for a customer who touched display models?" Judge Whitaker's eyes narrowed. His amusement was fading. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be the easy conviction he had expected. The courtroom shifted once more. People in the audience were no longer snickering at Malcolm. They were watching him with intrigue. This wasn't just a kid defending himself. This was a kid dismantling an entire case, piece by piece. The judge cleared his throat. "All right, smart guy, let's keep playing. Did the store owner identify you as the suspect?" Malcolm raised. an eyebrow. Lie. Whitaker's smirk returned. Oh, you're saying the store owner didn't say you were there? Malcolm shook his head. No, Your Honor. I'm saying the store owner never identified me as the thief. The officer who arrested me never asked the store owner to confirm it was me. That's why I was arrested blocks away based on fitting a description. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the court clerk stopped typing. Officer Greg Harper, standing in the back, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted toward the judge as if hoping for help. Malcolm took a step forward, his voice unwavering. Truth or lie, Your Honor? Are people innocent until proven guilty? The judge froze. The question was a trap. If he said lie, he would be violating the very principles of the justice system. If he said truth, he would have to admit that Malcolm had been assumed guilty without proper evidence. For the first time in his career, Judge Whitaker was speechless. The audience whispered among themselves, realizing what was happening. The courtroom, which had once been a stage for Whitaker's power games, was now a stage for his downfall. And Malcolm? He wasn't done yet. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Whitaker, the man who had spent years controlling this room with his gavel and authority, sat frozen, unable to respond. Malcolm's question, truth or lie, Your Honor? Are people innocent until proven guilty? Hung in the air like a loaded weapon. The judge shifted in his seat, gripping the arms of his chair as if to steady himself. His usual smugness was gone, replaced with something he had never felt in this room before, uncertainty. He had never expected to be challenged, let alone by a 14-year-old boy. Malcolm didn't break eye contact. His expression remained composed, controlled. He wasn't playing a game anymore. He was proving a point, and everyone in that room knew it. The prosecutor, sensing the tension, cleared his throat loudly. Your Honor, we don't have time for games. The fact remains that the defendant was found near the store, his fingerprints were inside, and he fits the description. That is enough evidence to move forward with the conviction. Malcolm slowly turned his head toward the prosecutor, his face still calm. Truth or lie, counselor? He asked. You said I fit the description. But isn't it true that descriptions are often vague and unreliable? That in many wrongful convictions, the so-called matching description was the only evidence? The prosecutor's jaw tightened. He had no answer. The audience leaned forward, intrigued. This wasn't the trial they had expected. They had come to watch a young black boy get put in his place by the system. Instead, they were watching him tear that system apart, piece by piece. Judge Whitaker, regaining some of his composure, slammed his gavel down. Enough. This is my courtroom. You don't run this trial, young man. I do. Malcolm smiled slightly. Is that so, Your Honor? Because it seems like right now, you're the one scrambling to keep control. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. A woman in the back covered her mouth, suppressing a laugh. Even Officer Harper, who had been standing stiffly by the wall, shifted his weight nervously. The judge leaned forward aggressively. Watch yourself. Boy, you're dangerously close to contempt of court. Malcolm nodded, still calm. Truth. But I also know that contempt charges require an actual disruption to the court proceedings. Answering questions and defending myself is not contempt. It's my right. Whitaker's face twitched. He had been outmaneuvered again. The tension in the room grew heavier. The prosecutor flipped through his papers, searching for anything, to regain control. Then, finally, he found something. "The store's security footage," the prosecutor said quickly. "Your Honor, we have video evidence of someone in a hoodie inside the store during the time of the theft. That is enough to establish probable cause." Malcolm turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, is that true or a lie?" The judge's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Malcolm folded his arms. "The prosecutor says the security footage proves something. But here's the problem. No one has seen the footage yet, not even my attorney. Isn't it a violation of due process to withhold evidence from the defense?" A collective murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face flushed red. The judge hesitated, his fingers twitching against the bench. He had allowed the prosecution to move forward without presenting full evidence, assuming this case would be quick and easy. Now, Malcolm had called him out. The bailiff stepped forward nervously. "Your Honor, the footage is available, but it was never formally submitted as evidence. The defense is correct." The room erupted into hushed conversations. Even people who had entered uninterested were now fully engaged. Judge Whitaker, backed into a corner, gritted his teeth. He had never been challenged like this before, let alone by someone he had dismissed as a child. Malcolm let the silence hang for a moment before delivering his next blow. "Truth or lie, Your Honor? If evidence was never properly presented, do I still have a fair trial?" A long pause. Then, finally, the judge looked down. His fingers clenched the gavel. But he didn't slam it. He didn't respond with anger. He knew the truth. And now, everyone else did too. The audience was no longer whispering. They were watching. Some in shock, others in admiration. A few, including Malcolm's mother sitting in the back, wiped tears from their eyes. The courtroom had shifted. It was no longer a place where Judge Whitaker had absolute control. Malcolm had proven his case without shouting, without pleading. He had used only logic, intelligence, and the very laws meant to convict him. For the first time in his life, Judge Whitaker had lost in his own courtroom. The prosecutor, realizing the trial had collapsed, sighed in frustration. "Your Honor, in light of these issues, He paused, struggling to say the words. "I recommend we drop the charges." Whitaker's face turned red. He had been cornered, outplayed, and humiliated. His voice came out cold and sharp. "Charges dropped. The defendant is free to go." Gasps filled the courtroom. It was over. Malcolm had won. But as he gathered his papers, Malcolm looked up, at the judge one last time. His expression was unreadable, his voice smooth as he said, "One last question, Your Honor. Truth or lie? If I weren't a legal genius, would I still be in jail right now?" The judge's breath caught in his throat. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Malcolm gave him one last knowing smile, then turned and walked out of the courtroom. And for the first time, Judge Whitaker was left speechless. Judge Whitaker sat motionless, his fingers still gripping the gavel, his mind racing. The boy, the kid he had mocked, underestimated, and tried to put in his place, had just walked out of his courtroom victorious. And worse, he had left behind a question that the judge couldn't answer. Malcolm's words still echoed in the judge's mind. Truth or lie? If I weren't a legal genius, would I still be in jail right now? The weight of it settled over him like a heavy chain, because the truth was painfully clear. If Malcolm hadn't been able to outsmart him, he would have been another statistic, another kid buried by a system that was never meant to protect him. As the courtroom began to clear, a sudden commotion erupted near the back. A young woman, a journalist, who had been silently taking notes during the trial, suddenly stood and held up her phone. "I just streamed the entire case live," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "And people are watching." Judge Whittaker's eyes widened slightly. He turned to the court clerk, but she was already staring at her computer. "You screen." Comments were flooding in. "Is justice for Malcolm was trending." The trial had been meant to be a simple, quiet case, an easy conviction that no one would question. But now, the world was watching. The prosecutor rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. "Your Honor, we need to get ahead of this before—" Too late. The doors to the courtroom burst open again. This time, several attorneys, civil rights, and activists, and even a few government officials entered. They had seen the trial in real time, and they had questions. A woman in a sharp navy blue suit, her presence commanding, stepped forward and addressed the judge directly. "Judge Whittaker, we've been investigating claims of bias in your courtroom for years. What we just witnessed today only confirms what we've suspected." The judge felt his pulse spike. He had been accused of bias before, but nothing had ever stuck. Now there was proof. The prosecutor tried to intervene, his voice desperate. "This is outrageous. Are you really going to launch an investigation over one case?" The woman didn't blink. "No," she replied, "not one case. But when a 14-year-old boy can expose the cracks in a system that has convicted hundreds, how many others have been wrongfully sentenced?" The room fell silent again. Judge Whittaker's breath came shorter now. He wasn't just dealing with a loss, he was dealing with exposure. Malcolm had walked away free, but his case had ignited something bigger. As the press gathered outside, waiting for a statement, Judge Whittaker knew that this moment wasn't just about Malcolm anymore. It was about his entire career. Malcolm stepped into the bright afternoon sun, taking his first deep breath of true freedom. His mother, Angela, rushed forward and pulled him into a tight hug. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "You did it, baby." Around them, people were cheering, clapping, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some had come to witness a routine, conviction, but instead they had witnessed history. A local journalist stepped up with a microphone. "Malcolm, how does it feel to have not only won your case but also exposed corruption in the courtroom?" Malcolm paused. He had spent so much time fighting, proving himself, staying ahead of the game, but he hadn't expected his case to become something bigger. He glanced back at the courthouse doors, where officials were still arguing with the judge. He knew what was coming: investigations, protests, change. Then he looked directly at the camera. "It feels like we're just getting started." Malcolm stood outside the courthouse, the warm afternoon sun hitting his face. He had spent the past few hours fighting for his freedom, but it wasn't just about him anymore. His mother, Angela, held his face in her hands, her eyes filled with pride and relief. "You did it, baby," she whispered again. But Malcolm could hear the weight in her voice, the years of struggle, the fear that had gripped her heart when he was arrested, and the sheer exhaustion of constantly having to prove their worth, in a system that was never built for them. The journalist, still holding her microphone, waited for an answer. The crowd around them had grown larger. Reporters, community members, and even strangers who had watched the trial online gathered, their eyes fixed on the boy who had just outsmarted an entire courtroom. Malcolm exhaled slowly. "It feels like we're just getting started. The journalist's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Malcolm glanced back at the courthouse doors. Inside, Judge Whitaker was still in a heated discussion with civil rights attorneys and government officials. The pressure was mounting. An internal investigation was already being discussed. Malcolm knew that this wasn't going to be another case that got swept under the rug. He turned back to the crowd and spoke clearly. "If I weren't a legal genius, I'd still be in that courtroom right now. I'd probably be in handcuffs, facing a sentence for a crime I didn't commit. And if that's true for me, how many others didn't get the chance to defend themselves?" The crowd murmured in agreement. Malcolm wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every wrongfully accused person who never got the chance to prove their innocence. Angela wrapped an arm around his shoulders, holding him close. She had always known her son was special. He had read legal textbooks as a child, debated attorneys for fun, and memorized constitutional rights before most kids even understood what they were. But today, he had done something even greater. He had shaken a system that had never expected to be questioned. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Judge Whitaker was losing his grip on power. His courtroom had always been his domain, a place where he ruled without question. But now, his past cases were being pulled up, and journalists were already digging into his history. The civil rights attorneys made it clear this wasn't just about Malcolm. They wanted to know about every case the judge had ever ruled on. The courtroom clerk, still at her desk, read through old files with shaking hands. She had worked under Judge Whitaker for years. She had watched countless young Black and Latino men sentenced unfairly. Some had been guilty, but many had not. She had never spoken up before, but today, as she watched the legal officials comb through the files, she wondered if she had been complicit in something bigger than she ever realized. Back outside, a young boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, stepped forward, looking up at Malcolm. His eyes were wide with admiration. "You're gonna be a lawyer, right?" he asked. Malcolm smiled. "That's the plan." The boy grinned. "Good, 'cause we need you." Malcolm felt something shift in his chest. For years, he had studied law because it fascinated him, because it challenged him. But today, he realized something deeper. He studied law because people needed him. People like this little boy, people like the ones inside that courtroom who never got a fair chance. A woman in a navy blue suit, one of the civil rights attorneys who had entered the courtroom earlier, approached Angela and Malcolm. "I work with a firm that focuses on overturning wrongful convictions," she said, her voice steady. "Malcolm, you're brilliant. We'd like to offer you a mentorship. You could work with real attorneys, study real cases, start using that mind of yours to help people." Angela gasped softly, placing a hand over her heart. Malcolm's eyes widened, but he didn't hesitate. "I'd love that." The crowd erupted into applause. Even those who had entered the courthouse expecting to see just another conviction now stood in awe of the young boy who had flipped the system on its head. As the press continued asking questions, as the attorneys and activists discussed the next steps, Malcolm realized that his fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. He turned to his mother and hugged her tightly. She had fought for him his entire life. Now it was his turn to fight for others. And as the courthouse doors creaked open again, revealing the panicked faces of those who had once held all the power, Malcolm knew one thing for certain. The world was watching now, and he was ready. As Malcolm stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by his mother, attorneys, and supporters, he took one last glance at the building that had tried to break him. Just hours ago, this place had been nothing more than another Courtroom. A place where countless young black boys like him had their futures stolen without a second thought. But today, he had changed the narrative. Judge Whitaker, once untouchable, was now under investigation. Lawyers were pulling up his past cases, journalists were asking the hard questions, and the legal system was forced to confront its own flaws. Malcolm hadn't just won his case, he had sparked a movement. He turned back to the cameras, his voice steady. This isn't just about me. It's about the people who never got the chance to prove their innocence. The people who were thrown away without a fair trial. If I hadn't been able to defend myself, I would have been just another statistic. So, my question is, how many more are still waiting for justice? The crowd nodded, some clapping, others recording every word. People weren't just inspired by his story. They were motivated to act. What do you think? Have you ever seen someone underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Do you believe the justice system needs reform? Let's talk about it in the comments below. If this story inspired you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. We need to keep these conversations going, because knowledge is power, and justice belongs to everyone. Thank you for watching, and remember, change starts with us. See you in the next story.